February 26, 1991, 3 o'clock in the morning. The road north from Kuwait City to Basra stretches empty under a moonless sky. Within hours, it will become something else entirely. The Americans will call it a turkey shoot. The Iraqis will call it a massacre. The Soviets, watching from thousands of miles away, will call it impossible. Inside a bunker complex beneath Moscow, a secure telephone rings. The officer who answers it listens for 7 seconds, says nothing, and sprints down a corridor lined with maps of the Middle East. He bursts into a conference room where 3 generals are reviewing satellite imagery. The words he speaks are simple. American aircraft are destroying an entire Iraqi division in real time. Every vehicle, every tank, every truck, and the Iraqis never saw them coming. The generals look at each other. One of them picks up a red telephone. Within 90 minutes, the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, has activated an emergency protocol not used since the Cuban Missile Crisis. They need to understand what just happened, because if the Americans can do this to Iraq's army, an army equipped with Soviet tanks, Soviet missiles, Soviet doctrine, then every assumption about Soviet military power might be wrong. The highway of death. You've probably seen the photographs. Burned-out vehicles stretching for miles, twisted metal, abandoned tanks. The images were broadcast around the world, and they caused such revulsion that President Bush ordered a ceasefire within 48 hours. But those images don't tell you what the Soviet analysts saw. They don't explain why, in a bunker beneath Moscow, military officers were experiencing something close to existential terror. Let's go back to the beginning. January 17, 1991. Operation Desert Storm begins. The Soviet Union is watching very carefully. Iraq's military is the 4th largest in the world. More importantly, it's equipped almost entirely with Soviet weapons. T-72 tanks, MiG fighters, SA-6 and SA-8 surface-to-air missile systems. The Iraqis have been trained in Soviet doctrine. They've built their defenses according to Soviet principles. Layered air defense, redundant command and control. Everything the Soviets taught their allies about how to fight a modern war. The Americans say they're going to destroy this military from the air. The Soviets are skeptical, very skeptical, because according to Soviet analysis, according to everything they know about air power and ground defense, it shouldn't be possible. You can't defeat a modern army with air power alone. History proves this. World War II proves this. Vietnam proves this. You need ground forces. You need to close with the enemy. Air power can soften them up, sure, but it can't win wars by itself. Then the bombing starts, and something very strange begins to happen. Iraqi air defenses are going dark, not all at once. That would make sense. A massive first strike overwhelming the system. No, they're going dark one by one. A radar station in Baghdad, a command bunker in Basra, an ammunition depot near the Kuwaiti border, each one destroyed with surgical precision. The Iraqis are firing their missiles blindly into the sky. Hundreds of missiles. But they're not hitting anything. Soviet intelligence officers are watching this through multiple channels. They have advisors still in Iraq, though most were withdrawn before the war started. They have signals intelligence. They have satellite reconnaissance. And what they're seeing doesn't match their models. The Americans are flying strike packages of 40, 50, 60 aircraft. Those packages should be showing up on radar like freight trains. The Iraqis should be able to track them, target them, engage them. But somehow, the Americans are appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Week 1 becomes Week 2. The Iraqi Air Force, once the 6th largest in the world, has effectively ceased to exist. Planes are fleeing to Iran. Hardened aircraft shelters, which Soviet engineers promised were indestructible, are being penetrated and destroyed. The Americans are using some kind of precision-guided munition that can fly down ventilation shafts. Soviet doctrine has no counter for this. Soviet doctrine didn't imagine this was possible. By the third week, GRU analysts are starting to compile reports that make their superiors uncomfortable. The Americans appear to have perfect intelligence on Iraqi positions. Not good intelligence, perfect intelligence. They know where every SAM battery is located. They know where command bunkers are. They know which roads the Iraqis use for resupply. Soviet military theory says this level of intelligence requires human sources, networks of spies, years of preparation. But the Americans couldn't have had years. The crisis only started 6 months ago when Iraq invaded Kuwait. There's another possibility. The Americans have some kind of overhead reconnaissance system the Soviets don't understand. Soviet satellites can take pictures, sure, but there's a delay. You take the picture, the satellite passes over a ground station, you download the data, you analyze it, you disseminate it. Hours or even days. But the Americans are acting on intelligence that seems minutes old, maybe less. Then comes the ground war. February 24th. The Soviet General Staff has run computer simulations. They expect the ground campaign to last weeks, maybe months. The Iraqis have 500,000 men, dug into defensive positions. They have minefields. They have artillery. They have tanks. Even with American air superiority, even with American technology, you can't just sweep aside a force that size. Wars don't work that way. The ground war lasts 100 hours. 4 days. The Iraqi army doesn't retreat. It disintegrates. And this is where the highway of death comes in. This is where Soviet observers watch something that shouldn't be possible. February 26th. Iraqi forces are pulling out of Kuwait City. It's not an organized withdrawal. It's a rout. Thousands of vehicles streaming north on Highway 80, the main road to Basra. Military vehicles mixed with civilian cars, buses, even fire trucks. Stolen property piled on top. It's chaos, but it's also a target. American aircraft arrive shortly after midnight. The first strikes hit the front of the convoy and the rear. The vehicles in between are trapped. What happens next lasts about 10 hours, and when it's over, the highway is a graveyard. But here's what the GRU analysts noticed. Here's what made them pick up those red telephones. The Americans hit every single military vehicle, every tank, every armored personnel carrier, every truck carrying troops or supplies. They did this at night, in smoke and dust, with vehicles scattered across miles of highway, mixed with civilian cars, moving in different directions as drivers tried to escape. And the American pilots could tell the difference. They could identify military targets from civilian vehicles in complete darkness while flying at 500 miles per hour. Soviet doctrine says this is impossible. You can't have that kind of target discrimination in those conditions. Even with the best pilots, the best training, the best night vision equipment, you can't do what the Americans just did. Not with iron bombs, not with unguided rockets. You'd need a computer. You'd need a computer in the sky, looking down at the entire battlefield, tracking every vehicle, feeding real-time targeting data to dozens of aircraft simultaneously. The GRU analysts request more intelligence. They want to know what aircraft the Americans used. The initial reports come back. F-15s, F-16s, A-10s, F-A-18s, A-6 intruders, Marine Harriers. These are all aircraft the Soviets know about. Good aircraft, modern aircraft, but nothing that explains what just happened. Then someone notices something in the electronic warfare reports. There's an aircraft operating over Iraq that's barely producing any radar signature. It's there, the Soviets can detect it through secondary means, but it's almost invisible to conventional radar. The F-117. The Americans have been flying a stealth aircraft over Iraq for weeks now. The Soviets knew it existed, theoretically. There were rumors. Aviation journals had published artists' concepts, but seeing it operate, understanding what it means, that's different. The F-117 can fly into the heart of Iraqi air defenses, drop precision, guided bombs, and leave without ever being detected. Every assumption about air defense is now in question, but the F-117 doesn't explain the highway of death. The stealth fighter is precise, yes, but it's a single aircraft dropping 1 or 2 bombs per mission. What happened on that highway required coordination across dozens of aircraft, required real-time intelligence, required something else. JSTARS. The acronym starts appearing in intelligence reports in early March. Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System. The Soviets pieced together what it is from multiple sources. It's a modified Boeing 707 with a massive radar array mounted underneath. It can see the battlefield from 200 miles away. It can track ground vehicles. It can tell the difference between a tank and a truck. It can see through smoke and dust and darkness. And it can feed targeting data directly to strike aircraft. The Soviets have nothing like this. They have airborne warning and control aircraft, AWACS equivalents, but those are designed to track other aircraft. The Americans have created a system that turns the entire battlefield transparent. Every Soviet tank, every Soviet armored column, every Soviet headquarters unit would be visible to American commanders in real time. There would be no hiding, no concealment, no surprise. But JSTARS still doesn't explain everything. The precision is too consistent. Soviet analysts keep returning to the same question. How are American bombs hitting targets with such accuracy? A conventional bomb, dropped from 20,000 feet, has a circular error probable of hundreds of meters. You might hit the right grid square, but hitting a specific building, a specific bunker, a specific tank, that's luck. The Americans aren't getting lucky. They're hitting exactly what they aim at, every single time. GPS, Global Positioning System. The Soviets know about it. They've been tracking the satellite constellation as it's been deployed, but they thought it was primarily for navigation. Ships finding their position at sea, aircraft knowing their exact location. The Americans have weaponized it. They've created bombs that guide themselves. You feed in the coordinates, you drop the bomb, and it flies itself to the target. The pilot doesn't need to see the target, doesn't need to dive on it, doesn't need to risk flying through air defenses. Just release the weapon and let it find its own way. By April 1991, the GRU has compiled a classified assessment. It's several hundred pages long. The conclusion can be summarized in a few sentences. The United States has achieved a revolution in military affairs. They have integrated space-based reconnaissance, stealth aircraft, precision-guided munitions, and airborne battle management into a single system. This system allows them to see the entire battlefield, strike any target at any time, and suffer minimal casualties in the process. The Soviet Union has no equivalent capability. Developing an equivalent capability would take a decade and cost billions of rubles. The Soviet Union doesn't have a decade. The Soviet Union doesn't have billions of rubles. This is the secret, the highway of death revealed. Not that American aircraft could destroy Iraqi tanks. Everyone knew American aircraft were good. The secret was that the entire Soviet theory of modern warfare was obsolete. Layered air defense, massed armor, redundant command and control. None of it mattered if the enemy could see everything and hit anything with precision. Soviet generals had always assumed that in a war with NATO, Soviet numerical superiority would compensate for technological deficiencies. The Soviets had more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft. They would overwhelm NATO defenses through sheer mass. The highway of death demonstrated that mass was irrelevant. American precision fires could destroy a Soviet tank column just as easily as an Iraqi one. Probably easier. At least the Iraqis had combat experience. Most Soviet units had never fired a shot in anger. There's a meeting in Moscow in May 1991. Senior military officers, political advisors, a few scientists from the defense industry. They're discussing the GRU assessment. Someone asks the obvious question. What would it take to match the Americans? The answer is sobering. The Soviet Union would need to redesign its entire military from the ground up. New satellites, new aircraft, new precision weapons, new command and control systems, new training, new doctrine. Everything. The cost estimates are astronomical. The timeline is measured in decades, and this is May 1991. The Soviet economy is collapsing. Republics are declaring independence. There are food shortages in Moscow. The idea that the Soviet Union could spend tens of billions of rubles modernizing its military is absurd. The country can barely pay its soldiers. 6 months later, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. There are many reasons for its collapse: economic stagnation, political corruption, nationalist movements, the war in Afghanistan. But the GRU assessment from April 1991 played a role that's rarely discussed. It made clear to Soviet military and political leaders that their country was no longer a superpower. Not in any meaningful sense. The United States had pulled so far ahead technologically that the Soviet Union couldn't compete. And if you can't compete militarily, if your nuclear arsenal is the only thing keeping you relevant, then what are you? You're not a superpower. You're a regional power with delusions of grandeur. The highway of death lasted 10 hours, but its consequences echoed for years. It changed how wars are fought. It demonstrated that precision and information dominance matter more than mass. It showed that stealth and surveillance could combine to make traditional defenses irrelevant. Every military in the world studied what happened on that highway. Everyone drew the same conclusion. The Americans had changed the game. But for the Soviet Union, the lesson was more fundamental. The highway of death revealed that the emperor had no clothes. Soviet tanks could be destroyed. Soviet air defenses could be evaded. Soviet doctrine could be rendered obsolete. All the weapons, all the divisions, all the military might that the Soviet Union had built over decades didn't matter anymore. The Americans had found a way to fight that made it all irrelevant. There's a photograph from the highway. It shows a T-72 tank, burned out, its turret blown off. In the background, you can see dozens of other destroyed vehicles stretching to the horizon. Soviet intelligence officers studied that photograph carefully. They measured the spacing between vehicles. They analyzed the blast patterns. They tried to reconstruct exactly what happened. And the more they studied it, the more they realized they were looking at the future of warfare, a future where the Soviet Union had no place. The highway of death, a 10-hour engagement on a road in Kuwait. Thousands of vehicles destroyed, hundreds of Iraqis killed. The Americans called it a military necessity. Critics called it excessive. But in Moscow, in a bunker beneath the Kremlin, Soviet intelligence officers called it something else. They called it proof. Proof that their country's military power was an illusion. Proof that the Cold War was already over, even if the politicians hadn't admitted it yet. Proof that the Soviet Union was a hollow shell, waiting to collapse. And 8 months later, it did. Some Cold War truths were buried on purpose. We dig them up here. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files.